10 years ago, Michael Brown was taken out by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, famously causing quite a bit of unrest. Depending who you are, you call it an uprising or a riot. So Friday night was the 10-year anniversary of that, and people were outside the Ferguson Police Department protesting. So some of the protesters started knocking down and pulling down the fence around the police station. So the police went outside. One cop got charged by one of the protesters and knocked down and fell to the ground. He's now in critical condition with some sort of brain injury, and he may or may not pull through. Now, of course, famously, 10 years ago, it was a white cop and a black victim. In this instance, it's a black victim again, but he's a cop, and there's a black person under arrest for doing it, Elijah Gant of East St. Louis. Though I'm interested to know how many outsiders showed up to protest there. But so the police chief is now black. He's very upset. He was emotional at the press conference. He pointed out that the officer that's in critical condition, Tavis Brown, I think, is a young black officer who specifically joined the Ferguson Police Department to be the change, to use Obama's phrase.
He is at an area hospital right now, fighting for his life. And I'm gonna break away a little bit from what I was planning to talk about. This police department, this Ferguson Police Department, since 2014, has been a punching bag for this community. The police department back in 2014, we don't even have them officers here anymore. So what are you protesting? These officers not even here no more. Everything that the activist community has advocated for, as far as body-worn cameras, implicit bias training, crisis intervention training, all this stuff, we have done all of this. What are we protesting? What is it? We even changed the uniforms at this police department because people said that the old uniforms trigger people.
Every single demand that the protesters made back, well, I don't know, there's all different protesters, but the formal demands for change, implicit bias training, changing the officers, etc., all those things have happened. There's only 4 police officers, even on the Ferguson force, that were there in 2014. The force in 2014, I think it had, in a city that was 67% black, Ferguson, it had like 50 of the 54 officers were white. Today now, the majority of the officers are black. I guess the stop and frisk has stopped. But just to refresh your memory on what happened with Michael Brown, Obama was elected in 2012. Him and Eric Holder, who he appointed as the Attorney General, they were pretty aggressive in charging officers around the country with civil rights violations. And after the grand jury failed to indict the officer in the Brown case, they took a hard look at it and they too chose not to indict. The case primarily, I think it can be described as Brown got into a dispute with the store owner about a blunt. Store owner said he stole it. He was walking down the street. The police officer pulled up next to him, refused to comply with his orders, and got in the head.
Different people are seeing different things tonight in this newly released video from this Ferguson convenience store. Keep your eye on the box of cigarellos. That's Michael Brown Jr. the night before he was killed in 2014 by a city police officer. A filmmaker and Brown's family says what he's doing here is trading the carton of smokes for marijuana, and they believe that he leaves the carton in the store hoping to come get it later.
That's not stealing the store.
That interpretation matters because of this video that authorities released days after the shooting. The next morning, Brown is back at the store in what police have always described as a strong-arm robbery, his one hand grabbing the cigars, his other on the storekeeper's neck.
The picture they painted of my nephew was not right.
Tonight, the store is adamant they don't do layaway, and they've released the full video that they say shows there was no exchange for drugs.
He's going to start arguing with the clerk because the clerk's going to tell him, no, I'm not taking marijuana. Get out of my store.
The prosecutor, who refused to charge Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson, agrees with the store.
The suggestion that he's coming back to pick up what he bartered for is just stupid.
Something that must be said, no matter what happened at this store behind me, it doesn't shed any new light on the confrontation that took place up the road between Michael Brown and Officer Darren Wilson.
I'll let everyone have their own opinion about that, but a grand jury failed to indict in Obama's Department of Justice, which could have came in with federal charges, which they did in a lot of cases, chose not to.
Breaking tonight, major developments in the Ferguson case that has divided the country and sparked violent protests. A Fox News source just confirming that the federal investigation into Michael Brown's death is now complete, and civil rights charges against Officer Darren Wilson are, quote, unlikely. So far, the DOJ not commenting. Andrew McCarthy is a former federal prosecutor and is now a National Review contributing editor. And so Eric Holder, strangely silent now that apparently his DOJ has concluded no charges against Officer Wilson are appropriate. What exactly have they concluded, according to these reports from the New York Times, and we have it as well? What exactly are they saying?
Well, what they're saying is what they could have figured out after the first hour or so of looking at this, which is that there's insufficient evidence to bring a criminal civil rights homicide case against this police officer. I think they've known that from the very beginning.
So 10 years of, and then of course what happened, there was unrest. I like to use the term unrest because that's neutral. You want to call it a riot, you want to call it an uprising, rebellion. There was violent unrest. And then a year after that, you had Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and the same thing happened. So this black police officer now is lying in critical condition for 29-year-old black male from East St. Louis, charged with $500,000 bond with attempted murder, which will be upgraded to murder, of course, if he passes away. So I think this would be a good time to think about what is the legacy, what's the outcome of what went on in 24 and 2015 with America putting a spotlight on violence by police versus, well, people, but pretty much, black people in general. Well, in the two places where the first events occurred, Baltimore and St. Louis, well, Ferguson's right outside of St. Louis, you saw a significant uptick, which has stayed, in violent crime in both cities. And academic analysis of the police forces in both those cities, because it's public record what everything a cop does, their arrests, their stop and frisk, etc. Both of those police departments seemingly in a form of silent protest or tacit or whatever, unnamed protest, stopped arresting as many people. They stopped pulling people over. Fewer guns were seized in both cities, as if both the Baltimore and the St. Louis police were saying, oh, you want to charge us with crimes? Well, we'll just stop doing our job so much, which of course is, inappropriate. But from the perspective of a police officer, I can't imagine wanting to be a cop, especially in a big city where stuff actually goes on, where your every action is going to be second guessed, which is not to say it shouldn't be. It's a job that seems like it should be quite high paying, and I think in maybe New York and LA and San Diego, San Francisco, maybe a few other places, it is a high paying job. In a lot of places, almost anywhere, it's not very high paying. Detroit police don't make that much money and have to deal with a lot of stuff. And of course, in the Freddie Gray case, most of the police officers were black. I think they all beat the case. I can't remember what happened with that. Did they all beat the case? And in America in general, the amount of police homicides on citizens, not saying they're justified or not justified, but they have increased every year since 2014, every single year. And so far in 2024, they're on pace to surpass 2023. They're in fact growing at a faster rate. So, and then of course we had what happened during the pandemic with the George Floyd, killing of George Floyd by a police officer who ended up getting a long prison term. People in Minneapolis destroyed a whole police precinct. Not sure what the crime situation in Minneapolis is. I should have looked it up. If this post is interesting, maybe I'll do some more research into this. But police have gotten more violent since 2014. Again, I would have to know every case to know was it appropriate or inappropriate, but they've gotten more violent. Violent crime in the United States has gone up since then as well, so America's a little bit more violent in general than it was in 2014. If you're old enough to remember or whatever, I can remember the 80s and 90s. Crime went way down. America got a lot safer, especially in the 2000s up through the 2010s. And then starting around that time, it slowly went up in some municipalities. Detroit has continued to go down a little bit, but Detroit, it was so high. Detroit's still, I think, second or something for violent crime. Measuring the outcomes of these protests in both cities and the anti-police sentiment, defund the police, seems like the only measurable change is that there's more violent police and that crime in a lot of cities, which are predominantly black, chiefly St. Louis and Baltimore and Chicago, has gone up quite a bit. Now, is this because the police are not aggressively doing their job because they're scared? Is it because they're teaching society a lesson, so to speak, and saying, oh, you don't want to give us carte blanche or we're going to do what we have to do? Tricky situation. So keep abreast of what's going on in your local law enforcement. There was a cop here named Eugene Brown back in the 2000s, an African-American police officer in Detroit. He shot 5 people and killed 3 in the space of 2 years. I interviewed a lawyer that sued the city of Detroit successfully for several $1 million on behalf of one of the families, the family of one of the guys he killed. And in this case, the guy was shot in the back and then he had powder burns on his chest as if Brown had placed a pistol on his chest to finish him off. And I was like, wow. And the jury found that that's what had happened. Not the criminal jury, the civil jury. And the lawyer referenced, he made an offhanded comment about throwaway guns. And I said, hold on, I said, Detroit police really ride around? They all have throwaway guns? And he said, well, I'm not going to say all, but that's very common. This was a lawyer who had used to be a Detroit cop. In fact, he worked in Detroit Internal Affairs. That's who investigates police, and he left that to become a lawyer, and he helped win millions of dollars against Officer Eugene Brown. The Detroit Police Officers Union protected Brown from being fired even after he was racking up millions and millions. I think it was over $10 million was paid out because of his actions, though he was never charged and no criminal court did anything. At that time, Detroit, it may still, but I know for the period of maybe 1999 to 2009, Detroit, it was Detroit and D.C. had the highest rate of police killing citizens. Again, Detroit, one of the most violent cities, so it kind of might go hand in hand. Hard to say. But, so I guess for someone who prays, pray for the Coptus and brain damage who joined the Ferguson Police Department to help change the Ferguson Police Department and was knocked down, has brain damage. And then also pray for him to stay alive so the guy that knocked him down doesn't get his charges upgraded to murder. He went down there to protest. Things got out of control. And they'll slam him. You see what they did to the people from January 6th. They gave them long terms. And right now in England, there were those riots, right-wing riots, or people just going out in the street because there was a false rumor that a Muslim immigrant stabbed to death 3 white children, which wasn't true. It was actually the child, a 17-year-old whose parents were Botswanan immigrants who weren't Muslim. And that only happened 10 days ago, and they've already convicted and sentenced people for inciting riot on Facebook and other things. So governments don't play around when it comes to attacking the police, because that can destabilize society. So
this police department in 2014 had 3 African American police officers. We have over 50% African American police officers, 23% female representation on this police department. Like I mentioned before, maybe 4 officers from 2014 remain here at the Ferguson Police Department. This is a brand new police department. I don't know why the officers here, who wasn't even here in 2014, have to continue to suffer through this. It doesn't make any sense. This young officer, Travis Brown, got into this job because he was inspired to do the right thing. He wanted to be part of the change. He wanted to make an impact in our community. He's the type of officer that we want in our community. And what happens? He gets assaulted. I had to look his mother in the eye.
The never-ending saga of Ferguson, all caused by some interaction between Michael Brown and a cop that the federal government and local didn't want to charge as a crime. That police officer, he moved on. That was during that whole time Zimmerman, and then you had Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, and you had George Floyd, and you had many other. It was a long period of time where the nightly news reveled in showing these type of events, and it upped the profile to the U.S. population. But for everyone that protested, do you keep up with the impacts? Is it just something to do? Because every year since Michael Brown, there's been more police causing the death of citizens and crime in Baltimore. And St. Louis is up, but the Ferguson Police Department has a different demographic. But so there you go. Well, profit American dope.